Good evening again. We're not going to have any other particular items other than our featured speaker for the evening. So it's my privilege and honor to tell you a little more about him that you don't already know, though from what I have found out, a lot of you know a lot more than I do about him. So, but regardless of that, let me tell you that about 40 years ago, I was looking for a school for my son to go to college. I discovered Hillsdale College when I heard the president of Hillsdale speak at an AAPS meeting. Consequence, huh? I was very impressed with the appearance and the outlook of the school, and especially the atmosphere on the campus. I took my son and visited. He was likewise impressed and agreed that this was the place for him. So he enrolled. And with that step, I became what is in today's world considered an enlightened parent that would allow his children to attend any school, any college in the country that they wanted to, the college of their choice. But the tuition would be paid at Hillsdale College. Is that enlightened or not, huh? Over the ensuing years, my wife and I have continued to be full supporters of the school with its independence and the freedom that it promotes. Our speaker, Larry Arnn, came on the scene in the year 2000 and has not only promoted but has expanded its sphere of influence. His education was initially at Arkansas State, then getting a master's and a PhD at Claremont Graduate School. Went to England, studied there at the London School of Economics and at Oxford University, as well as being the research director for Martin Gilbert, who is Churchill's biographer, as perhaps you know. He then returned to the Claremont Institute in California as the president in 1985. Stayed there for 15 years and then came to Hillsdale in the year 2000. As the 12th president of a school and had been in existence for 156 years. So that's pretty much telling you a lot about a particular school, much to your surprise, because except for him, you would never have known of Hillsdale. Under his leadership, the efforts of Hillsdale have continued to grow with the expanded population of imprimis, which probably most of you receive or at least know of. The online courses on the Constitution and on Western civilization, and the establishment of the Kirby Center on Constitutional Studies in Washington, D.C. Really remarkable events. The imprimis started in the 70s, and now I think has what, 2.5 million, just past 4 million in its distribution. Dr. Arnn is really the ideal person to speak to us about resisting the pressures to accept government money and the attached directives that go with it, since he has continued Hillsdale's independence and is really a shining leader to other people and institutions of how to combat government influence and maintain our freedoms. So I would present to you for the evening Dr. Larry Arnn.
Very tall. See that? Do you know how tall Winston Churchill was? He was exactly this tall. I think Dan's too tall. Thank you, Dan. There have been about 600 people who are related to Dan come to Hillsdale College. And one of the first things I learned was how important they all are. And then later I learned how delightful they are. Glad to see you. Thank you. So you guys are hilarious. You know the difference between an economist and an accountant? An accountant has a sense of humor. You won? Yeah. My wife once had a Swiss waiter, and I said, "Boy, you guys are efficient." He said, "Yeah, Germans without the laughter." So you have a sense of honor. You have young people. You say superb prayers. You can heal people. You put up with imposters. My friend Tom Perrell, who's a vet, who's sitting in here tonight. And I don't know, I've got this little thing in my side, but maybe Tom is the one to fix it. So I'm going to tell you 2.5 things. Before I do that, I'll just tell you why I came here. It turned out that 400 years ago, I knew a man named Robert Gregg, and he was your past president. And I learned about what this is back then. I've spoken twice to AAPS groups somewhere way back in the distant mystery. And I really loved that guy. And he would come to persuade me that health care was the most important crisis in America. And I would argue back to him that that's naive. There are many. But I really loved that man, and I am so delighted to come here tonight and see that you are still what you were. So here's my 2.5 points. I don't know anything about health care, and you do, so I'd be a fool to talk about that. So I'll do what academics do. I'll talk a circle around it. In particular, I'm going to answer 2 questions. Is health care a right? And the other is, what should we do about it today? The second one's harder, but it's actually not unique. I don't know what you guys think. Probably you think health care is the most important thing, which if you did think that, I bet you don't think that. That would be you elevating the body above the soul. But I don't think you do that. But actually, I'm going to argue that it's typical. It is, by the way, exactly like education, which I do know a lot about, and which is treated exactly the way you are treated. I mean, I don't know any healthcare regulators. I know some education regulators. I know some of them who are people of good opinions. But all of them that I've ever met are all stupid when it comes to the question of education. They don't know anything about it. And they've invented a whole language to give an account of it. And it doesn't have, I mean, did you watch the hearings where the current Secretary of Education was confirmed? There wasn't anybody in the room. I'll tell you, I did this not long ago. I was invited to the White House to be in a small group of people, 12 people, including Jared Kushner and a couple of important people, to talk about higher ed. And I've been to meetings like that 5 or 6 times in my life. This is the first good one. And here's why. The new Undersecretary of Education is a lady named Diane Jones. And we were all asked, they wanted us to give them a bold idea to reform education and liberate it. First of all, liberate it, right? And so we're asked to go around, I guess there were 9 of us civilians there, and say what the single most important thing was. And so when it got to me, I said, starting tonight, the Department of Education should start accurately to describe what education is. Which, by the way, in my knowledge, they've never done. And the new Undersecretary of Education picked up her pen and said, "Ooh, what is that?" And we talked about that for 15 minutes. She took notes. One of the principles of practicing medicine, isn't it? The one should do the work who knows. Somebody who doesn't know shouldn't tell them. But that's my first point, because isn't it a principle of self-government that each person has a right to rule the things that mainly concern themselves? What does it mean that there are thousands. I mean, you know how many people there are, civilian employees of the government of the United States? 23 million. And 21 million of them are state and local. And the number hasn't changed a lot. There's something else going on. But I'll get to that. So, first question, is there a right to education? So here's what James Madison says. The term right, in its particular application, means that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in exclusion of every other individual. In other words, your property, your right, he's actually talking about property right, a specific right. He talks about others later. Your property right is the stuff you can own and own yourself. And as long as you don't steal it from somebody, it's about anything. People won't tend to accumulate things that are not useful. I mean, then they get really rich and they don't need useful things anymore. So, one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other. In its larger and juster meaning, it embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right, which leaves to everyone else the like advantage. Now, what he's saying is you can't have a right, a property right, or any other kind of right to anything that we can't all have all we want of without taking from anybody else. And what that means is we can all talk. And we can even all talk at the same time. And if it's annoying that other people are talking while you're talking, you can go somewhere else. We can all pray. We can all pray a lot. We can all pray at the same time. We can all assemble. And if we don't like the assembly, we can leave. We can all exercise dominion over our property, meaning what we earn, what we accumulate. And we need to accumulate because, you guys know better than I know, our bodies are perishable. If they're not sustained every day, then you'll die in a few days. It's an interesting thing about us because we're just like dogs and cats in that regard, and yet we're different from them. In every way, we're different from them because of one thing. We know about tomorrow. What we're really different from them is we can talk. We can use common nouns, which they can't do. That's the whole difference right there. But it comes to find out once you can do that, then all of a sudden, you can take care of the future. Because if you have to earn your living every day de novo, it's a precarious existence. And we can see ahead. Also, children, right? And they depend on us. We need to preserve. Property, rights, is the safeguard against perishing. But then Madison goes on to say, and see, just remember, everything connected to that, every one of us in this room, if we mean by property, the stuff we've earned or was given to us by somebody who earned it, and if you mean by prayer, and you mean by speech, and you mean by the press, and you mean by all of those things, the common sense meaning of them, it's actually true that there's no need for any conflict between anyone if that's what rights mean, because we can all have all we want. Madison goes on to say that this property right, see, because this is, because as you know, being what you are, right? It turns out you could never make sense of the human being who lies on your table if you didn't imagine it having a soul. And the reason is, how does it do what it does? Aristotle describes it this way. He says, if you look up in a tree in the winter, it's bare. A branch breaks off and falls. It bounces here, it bounces there, it bounces there. It hits the ground, it bounces up, and it stops. Up in the same tree, there's a bird. And the bird takes off, and it flits in and out. And it doesn't hit the branches, and then it lights on another one. What's making it do that? its principle of motion is within itself. And you'll never account for it except by accounting for that. It can move and choose where it goes. Seems to be able to do that. Before you even try to explain how does it happen to be able to do that, which is a very difficult, I argue, even impossible so far thing to explain, you know that that's happening. Well, all you got to do is just take that bird, you know, the difference between the bird and the branch, and then add another dimension. What if the bird looked at you and said, "How are you today?" Do you know what that would require of the bird? And no bird ever does it. My wife gets tired of me telling the story, but in my family we raise children and boxer dogs. And we raise them exactly alike for the first 2 years. They live on the floor and they eat each other's food. And then when they get to be 2 years old, the children start talking. And the dogs never do. And 6 months after the children start talking, their world is populated by almost all of the same things ours is. Eskimos and the Arctic and the desert and camels. Many things they've never seen even to this day, right? How do they know what those are? Think how liberating it is, right? And that's going on inside this being. And to try to describe it, if you try to describe it as brilliantly as it can be described, you'll end up writing Aristotle's book on the soul, a very great piece of writing, right? So Madison says that it's got this body and it's got this soul. And the property rights of the thing come from the combination of those two things. Wolves, they're just like us. They could perish tomorrow if they don't. And you know what they do? They become territorial and they try to defend their stuff, right? But nobody could conceive of a right to do that because the wolves just always do just what they do, always the same. And they never come up and have a conversation about it. After he lays all that out in this essay, it's in 1792, called Property is the title. After he lays all that out, he says, but there's another kind of property, and it's more important. Because this thing that makes us different from everything else, right? The exercise of that, everything connected to the exercise of that. This prayer that we had tonight. All of us keeping a sense of honor. This is a group of people bound together by conviction in a profession where people get pretty prosperous. And so that means that you are spending your time not with people simply who are at the top of their field, although I bet many of them are, or who can help you make more money. You're here because you share something with them, and you want to share it better, right? That thing, you have a right to do that. Madison writes, as it can be said that a man has a right to his property, so it can be said that he has a property in all his rights. Now, I'll explain it briefly in a minute, but I'll tell you what you guys are asking for is you are asking for the authority that is rightfully yours to ply your trade with the people with whom you ply it. And see, Tom Perel, who's an awesome guy, right? First of all, I think you've got to be a good person to be a vet. Because you just got to like animals, and if you don't like animals, you can't be a human. It's a funny thing. Animals don't really like animals. We do. So that's a great thing to be. But this is different, what you do, right? Because they walk in there and they can talk to you. And that means you have to consult them in a different way. And you have to do it because you can. So you see that picture? Now, if you had a right to health care, let's say it's very easy to illustrate it in this room, it would mean that anyone who demands it has got a right to conscript your labor for free. They hide that, right? And you're not very good people to make this point because people think you're being selfish, right? Whereas I can make it, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm the other kind. But think about that for a minute, right? Because you've got families and you've got needs and you must have your property. And you want also, You want to build your work. You want to get good at it. You want to specialize maybe, or you want to specialize in generalizing. That's a kind of a way to be good, right? And you want that. And your effort and your wakefulness when you're tired and your setting high standards that cost you time and money, which are both limited, those are all yours. And if you don't give those things, then you won't be a very good doctor. And Madison says you've got a right to that. And that means that nobody can demand those services. Whereas if you interfere with somebody saying a prayer or talking, that's just wrong. Whereas you are not required. You can't possibly be required to sacrifice everything under your responsibility to take care of somebody who's not. Because everything under your responsibility would die. And yet it's that responsibility that makes you human. No, there's no right to health care. It's foolish to say so. Although, I'll explain quickly in a minute, I can show you where Winston Churchill said so. And he was not a foolish man. More on that in a minute. Is there a constitutional power for the federal government to regulate medicine? Yeah. And you know where to look. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution tells the things that Congress has the power to legislate about. There are 17 paragraphs. And do you know they fit into 3 groups? 9, more than half of the paragraphs are about national defense. And how many is there? 9, and then 3 would make 12. 5 of them are about guaranteeing a national system of commerce and property rights. And 3 of them are about the federal government having the authority to operate on the property where it operates. Forts and stuff like that. See? So, you see, that's what it does. That's what the government is supposed to do, the federal government. The state governments have much broader powers. The federal government has those. Now, the people who wrote the Constitution didn't mention health care. But also, you know, it's curious. They didn't mention education. And unlike politicians today, they actually had an education. And the second thing is, do you know about the Northwest Ordinance? It's passed in the summer of 1787 while they were debating the Constitution. It's passed by the Articles of Confederation Congress. And it takes 1/36 of the Western lands. And they don't know in that day how big the Western lands are. They didn't find that out until 1807, right? But they take, however big it is, they take 1/36 of it and they devote it to education in each township. A huge thing, right? But their control ended after they did that. Because they didn't think they were supposed to be administering things that were local. And so the point is, although they cared about education, I mean, they actually gave it the largest gift it has ever been given or is likely ever to be given. They just didn't think they should direct it. The sovereign unit in education turns out to be called school. That's where the teachers and the parents are gathered to work out with their children how they're to learn. And that ain't rocket science. I mean, in college it is, but... And that's a different thing in some ways. So there's no right and there's no constitutional authority. And I'll tell you, that argument is simple. You guys have heard it before, right? And it is the clearest thing in the world. And it would be more honest if people would admit that and say that we found a better way. And they do increasingly because, you know, if you notice, things are not going really well in our country. There have been some controversies of late. But the question is, what do you do? And I have to make my half a point in between why the federal government shouldn't be do this and what do you do? Because my solution is actually going to involve the federal government continuing to do things. I think that's necessary. But here's the thing. Here's the aside. Here's the middle point. Do you have any idea how much the government of the United States has grown? Because it has grown in numbers of dollars. It's grown massively. Much more sensitive than that is how's it grown in relation to the economy? And do you know why that's sensitive? That's sensitive because we are the first great liberal society, and what that means is free. And to have a liberal society, there have to be a lot of things that are private. And so we can live our human lives fully, right? We should raise our children. I'm teaching these totalitarian novels, and next week we're doing Brave New World. And that's one where the children are manufactured. And they do that because they want them to come out right, so they can control the society completely. Because they feel like they can, and they feel like they need to, because there have been wars and stuff, right? But if you're not going to do it that way, then the story that's in every one of yours noggin and heart will be all over the place. You will have worked long hours. You will have proved yourself at some examinations that are competitive. You will have achieved what you set out to achieve. And then you will have tried to set a standard to be good at it and not just get by, right? That's yours, right? And that's why you're good at it, and that's why you like it. Everybody's like that. And so if you raise their kids for them, and if you take care of everything about them, where's the room for them to live? And so what's happened, I can tell you in numbers. Anytime before 1900, the state, federal, and local government combined were about 7% of the gross domestic product of the country. The largest was local. The second largest was state. The smallest was federal. It changed some in the First World War. By 1925, it was running at 12%. Then the Great Depression, 32%. Then the Second World War, and after, and now. It's been up, actually, the year that this organization was founded, I looked it up, 1943, right? Do you know that that's one of the very rare times in human history where the government of the United States has been bigger than it is right now? Because it got up to 45% in 1945, and then it fell off a lot after that, as it did after the First World War, too. And so the point is, right now, absent the influence of war, the government is the largest percentage of the economy than it's ever been. And add to that it's centralized now. And so it's a quantitative change and a qualitative change. And both are very significant, because if you can articulate a government, you can do it the typical way. You can say, the barons and the earls and the nobles and the king, they're the best families because they won their wars a long time ago and they've got a bunch of land, and they're the ones who've got the leisure to learn how to lead us. And so we're going to perpetuate that kind of rule. That's very common. Another kind of rule is priests and religious leaders, right? They're going to rule. You know, when it happened first in human history, that it was proclaimed that no human being may ever govern another rightly except with his consent. That's, of course, on the 4th of July, 1776. Did you know that the King of England answered that 3 times, explicitly took on the argument? And as you know, it's famous, he got his butt kicked. But that's earth-shaking, and yet it's written in everything I've said about our own experiences. And remember, I claimed that 2-year-olds start down that road, and nobody ever teaches them to talk. They just start. And the dogs never do, and never will. Isn't that like an iron fact? And it's a miracle that it was not recognized fully until the birth of our country, and it's a tragedy that it's being lost. Because just think about, forget for a minute if it's efficient or not. I mean, I don't know, what do you think? Do you think it's efficient to make rules about how you charge your patients and how you're reimbursed and what procedures you can use from somebody who's not even a medical doctor and even done by a committee full of such somebodies? Does that work? You know, do you know that Title IV of the Higher Education Act, which is about student loans and stuff, I asked a lawyer to send it to me one time because it's the thing we don't do, right? And we get a lot of relief for that, although nobody in America today is relieved. And the lawyer said to me, he's a guy in Washington, famous, excellent lawyer, famous lawyer in this field. He said, Dr. Arnn, you won't be able to read it. And I said, I'm pretty smart, and what are you, a lawyer? I could have been that, but I decided to become an educated man. And it's actually true. But, and he said, no, he said, I can't read it either. He said, we keep a specialist here. She's the one who knows the rules. The Department of Education calls her. Now, do you see what that means? It means that it's always ambiguous what the actual rule is. And that is a synonym for despotism. If the laws be so voluminous and changeable that the citizen cannot know what they are, even if they are made by the proper process, they are still illegitimate. James Madison, Federalist 73. So when you see, I don't know, you guys, so I kind of know how to run a business. I have a lot of employees and it's a big, complicated business, right? But I've learned from Winston Churchill and Aristotle, oddly enough. I've learned to be simple, right? So I don't like 2-page memos. I don't like lists of things to do that have more than 5 items on it, and 3 is way better. I don't like rules at all. I like goals. Because a goal, you can say to somebody who's working for you, a nurse or a receptionist, you can say, let's make this great. And then that's like a promotion, right? Kids come in my office all the time. It's a very joyful thing to work with young people. And because, they can do anything we can do, they just haven't yet. And so it makes them foolish and easy to laugh at. And there's so much potential in them that it's just awesome, right? I sat down with those guys, or I stood over there and lectured them for a minute because I can't resist. What's not wonderful about that? And if they come in the office, because I've got like 30 or 40 of them working in my office now doing the Churchill biography and stuff like that, who's almost finished with that thing. And they'll come in and say, Dr. Arnn, you want me to do so-and-so? And I'll say, yeah, I guess, Often I won't know that they've been asked to do it. And they say, well, how do you want me to do it? And I always say, successfully. And they go, oh, okay, right? And, then they make mistakes too, but it's amazing what they do. And so this telling people details. We had an athletic conference meeting on Monday in Cedarville. And, the NCAA, it's just the pukiest thing you've ever heard of. If it was one step worse, it would actually be the government. I mean, you might think I'm joking. I'll send you some of its documents, right? And so, I'm in there. And we've got this really smart conference commissioner, which is a contradiction in terms. And he reads this thing out, and he wants us to pass it. And I said, what? And he looks at me and he says, okay, I take that back. We'll deal with this next time. See? That's human relations. Winston Churchill, they asked me when I became the president of the college, they said, how'd you learn how to manage? You don't seem to have any education in your background on management. I said, yeah, none at all. And they said, how'd you learn? I said, well, a few ways. I said, I've made a lot of mistakes. I try not to make them twice. And then I said, you know, it's amazing what you I said, Peter Drucker, do you know who that is? He used to be my landlord. And they were all these business guys. They were all really impressed with that. I said, I never studied with him. I just knew him for a long time. But I said, you know, I read Aristotle and Churchill. And they said, what'd you learn from Churchill? It is at once the glory and the safeguard of mankind that it is easy to lead and hard to drive. Isn't that beautiful? Think about that. This is the man who killed Adolf Hitler. That's what he did. It's one of the greatest things that any human being has ever done. And he did it with his faith and his eloquence and his lethal insight into human affairs. But they were always charitable and benign, and that's why he thought he could beat Hitler. This doesn't work, right? Aren't we all mad? The federal government started becoming openly and comprehensively bureaucratic in about 1960. The ideas were born in the 1880s. And if you can Gallup polls go back to the 40s, and you can track the polls. Do you trust and approve of the federal government? And they're going along like this, and from 1960, they just do this. And they've been doing it ever since. How many Americans think today we have a system of consent of the governed? Last poll, 21%. And just remember, that makes it vulnerable. And so that's my middle point. And the reason it's important is I want you to understand the way we did it for so long is the most beautiful way of governing human beings ever known, at least in the modern world, right? And we have changed that. And that's a change like a revolution. I had two wise, great friends of mine last week. One of them wrote a paper and one of them gave a talk at the college. And they were quite independent, and they both used the expression cold civil war. Because there's two kinds of life being promoted on two different premises, two different purposes and objects, two different methods of rule. And your thing, medical care, that's just one of them. It's just like the others. But because you practice that, and because it's a particular kind of demanding craft, and because you've got some principles about it, that makes you important. Doctors are respected people. Thank you for keeping this up. So now my last point, what do we do? So do you realize that the government, if you count the regulatory cost, although you realize you can't really quite know how big the government is, it's very difficult to make an accurate count of or list of the lawmaking bodies in America. It's certainly more than 150. And so the thing is, it's got to be more than 50%. And that means in this liberal society, and see, Madison writes in the 63rd Federalist, he says, it's the first purely representative government. So that's a revolution. They didn't think of it in the classic world. There's never been one. And so to understand him, just imagine a big circle. And that's all of us, the society, everybody in it. And imagine a little circle. Now, the little circle is the government. And when you say purely representative, it means that sovereignty is out in the big circle, but ability to do things in the government is all inside the little circle. And that means we can't do anything except vote. It was designed that way specifically. So it would be a check on us as well as on the government. And so we would talk a lot between elections, and it's always better, as your mother said, to think before you act, right? So it's a very beautiful thing the way we did. And it worked for like longer than any has ever worked. But now if you take that little circle and you make it half the whole, now all of a sudden, where is the sovereignty? Has it moved inside the big circle? And that's despotism, right? And I think we're on the verge of that. Now, you're not going to eliminate. Now, here's another thing. There are actually two innovations in the government of the United States since the early days, right? this change I'm talking about, it consists in the creation of a central regulatory state to manage the private affairs of people. And it exists in an entitlement state to take care of their retirement and their poor relief and stuff, and your health care. Now, the entitlement state is bigger, and the regulatory state is very big. And the regulatory state is where the army is. You know, because the modern force that's behind the growth and entrenchment of government, the swamp, Trump calls it. You know, a bunch of friends of mine have been writing about that for 30 years now, right? And then this guy comes along and he's talking about it. I was amazed and pleased. But that, you see, so he's taken on the regulatory state. And that could be a political necessity because the entitlement state's what the people get. And who's going to rescue this situation if not the people? And it's very difficult to get them to give up any of that. And, you know, it's going to bankrupt us if they don't. But it's very difficult to get them to give up that because they think the whole thing's a cheat anyway. Why are they going to take my part? How do you crack that nut? And then I'll tell you something more important about Winston Churchill than that he killed Adolf Hitler, which he did. More important than that, because Hitler would have won, right, except for him. He did something crazy and great. And the reason he did it is really great, because he knew that kind of thing can't work, because it's inhuman. But then it turns out that, you know, really great statesmen are very rare. You know, name 10 like Washington, 10 like Lincoln, 10 like Churchill. You know, those three guys, they come once 100 years. Churchill is the one who lived in our time. This time when modern science makes us so powerful and transforms both war and the way we live our lives in domestic policy. This time in which we have the wealth and the scientific impulse to try to regulate everything from a point of view of expertise. Lincoln didn't confront that as explicitly as we do today. Churchill did. And you know, he said what to do about health care. It's amazing. I couldn't believe it. I thought that the weakness in Churchill, for years and years and years, I thought the weakness of Churchill was that he was friendly to the entitlement state. But, you know, finally I had to write a book about it, and so then I had to go learn what he actually said. I don't even like that stuff. But I did. And, of course, when you get inside it, there are wonders there. I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll shut up. Churchill invented, with two other people, the British welfare system. 1908, 1909. Why did he do that? He was afraid of the socialists. And the British have an aristocratic heritage. And so there's class divisions there that until lately have been unknown in America. And so he came up with this scheme. He and David Lloyd George, but he was the clever one. And I found out the deep intention of it. I'm going to read you the quote that shows what it is. And this is years later in 1925. But what it said was, you know, in a pound, there's back then 144 pence. And 144, 244. 240. See, I married an English woman, right? I don't have to remember anything like that. They organized so that 9 pence in every pound would go to the post office where you'd buy stamps and you'd put them in a book. That means, by the way, they didn't have to hire anybody new or build a new building. And these books were cashable in for benefits if you were unemployed or injured or broke and needed health care. Now, where did the 9 pence come from? 3 pence came from the employee and 4 pence came from the employer, which means really 7 pence came from the employee. That's the way withholding tax works in America right now. But 2 pence, tuppence, came from the government. Just 2 pence from the taxpayer, right? And so people were buying insurance. And they weren't on the dole, and yet they were wedded to the system that arranged that. And the key to Churchill's thinking about that was insurance, right? You should hear him write about it. It's just beautiful how he can talk. So in 1925, and when I found this, I understood. And I'd read it before, but it takes so long to understand. Where is it? Okay, I have to paraphrase it. So, because it didn't do, but I can tell you what it is. Churchill becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer in November of 1924. And he has an industrial deputation come in. And there's a note taker. And they just talk. And Lord Weir, a friend of his, an important man, a very rich man, an industrialist, says, you know, Winston, we've always believed in thrift and personal industry. And he said, that's done good for our country. So why do you have this thing, which is a government-sponsored insurance system? And Churchill said, and this is the most candid thing I know that he ever said about this, so I know some others too. He said, yeah, he said, that's right, he said. And it does cost something. You do lose something. Inefficiency. But he said, have you watched how people vote since we put that in? Working classes. They're Tories now. They're in favor of property rights. They want to protect the economy because they benefit from it. And you know, that system was extended and kept pure in that way until 1945, when after the devastation of the war, the Labor Party got in and socialized everything, right? But that was stable, right? And so what I think is, and I'll just close with this point, it is true that it would be wrong, as Thomas Jefferson said in his second inaugural address, it would be wrong to take from one and spare to another because the one had more money. That's wrong, right? And you can't have a right to anything that costs money. On the other hand, the way constitutions work is that it's also not a good idea to let your neighbor starve in the street. And so what if we could convert these things into real insurance programs? And it costs a lot. And it's possible, by the way, because I will tell you, I think that this is the third really severe crisis in the history of the United States. And I think, like the other two, we might not get through it. But on the other hand, I think that's an opportunity for people like us, isn't it? Because we can read about the people who helped us get through the first two. And you just have to ask yourself the question, are you capable of that? And the answer is, how bad do you want to be? Our fathers did it, and our mothers. Penny's father was a British officer. He was a lawyer, but he was a British officer and a camp commander of a Japanese POW camp for 4 years. Penny's mother was a plotter for the Royal Air Force. 4 of my uncles were wounded in Korea and one of them killed. This is a really desperate time, isn't it? Isn't that made for people like us? And then the point is, if we can just get control of this thing a little bit, there are wonderful things to do that would bind the nation together and protect the Constitution as a form of limited government. So I would encourage you to study those, as I do, and I thank you for your work.
Dr. Arnn is willing to take questions, so Jeremy has the microphone right there.
Thank you, Dr. Arnn. I'm Christine Severin from Dayton, Ohio. And you mentioned Cedarville. That's not too far from us at all.
Yeah.
And you talked about Hillsdale College not taking any federal aid. I have a son who graduated from Grove City College in Pennsylvania.
Couldn't get into Hillsdale?
That's funny. Okay, that's a good one. I'll tell him that. And that, as you know, they also refused federal aid. In fact, there's a Supreme Court case. I know that you're aware of it in the mid-80s.
We were parties to that case.
Oh, okay.
The reason their name is on that case and not ours is because we won our case at the appellate level and they lost theirs.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, anyway. But I like to talk about it.
And we both lost. If
Yeah.
we'd had 5 more votes in the Supreme Court, we would have won.
Yeah. What I was going to mention, something that comes through on the some of the stuff we get from them, is that since the U.S. Since the right to refuse federal aid, it's like the federal government wants to punish people who want to refuse federal aid, like the physicians here we've been talking about at the meetings. If you don't want to play ball with them, they make life miserable for you. And one of the things that Grove City talks about, and I was wondering if Hillsdale has a similar issue, where some of the college rankings, they don't want to rank you if you don't take federal aid.
That's a 3-year-old deal.
Yeah.
What they did, Obama administration. And now, for God's sake, the Wall Street Journal, where I have 3 kids who are on their editorial board. So they thought of this idea, because quick points about education. You have to ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of education? And if you talk about anything that's a trade or to make a living, that is lower than the highest kind of education. And I say that to a room full of doctors. But you all know that, because the most important thing in your life is not doctoring. The most important thing in your life is the good that you do by it, right? Everybody knows that. The first and the last question in philosophy is the meaning of the good. So now, if you reduce education, which is what's going on, to just making a living, and the Republicans are at least as bad as the Democrats about this, then you have turned the young into factors of production. So their new way to evaluate colleges is they take the data from the Internal Revenue Service, and they take the data from the student loans, of course nobody else on earth could get that data, and we don't have federal student loans nor Grove City, and so then they rank you heavily on how much money your kids make and whether they pay back their loans. And so that's a great thing, not about what they learn, not about that, right? About that. And so we can't be included in that, they tell us, because there's no student loan data. And we say, well, we have student loan data. And, unlike theirs, our kids repay the loans. But that's the thing that's going on right now. And the Wall Street Journal has launched its own thing last year, and it's just repeated it this year. And we're not in it, and Grove City's not in it. Yes, sir.
David Levine from Columbus, Georgia. Thank you for a very inspiring talk, Dr. Arnn. But you forgot to tell us why Churchill thought that health care is a right.
Well, he meant this. First of all, Churchill is very capable of speaking for himself. And what he said was that in our society where we owe each other so much, then we cannot let anyone die for want of care. He said that. And I think that's true, by the way. Because just remember, here's a funny thing. Are you aware that human life is imperfect and always will be? And so the principles of the American Revolution are very clear. But on the other hand, we all, clear in our individual rights. And I think that's necessary to set up a government where those can be protected. On the other hand, we all got moms and dads, and if we don't have kids, we're going to die alone, and that'll be sad. And we all got to make a living, and we all got to help each other, and we can all talk, and Aristotle writes that makes us closer than any other beings. So what was taken, one of the greatest advances in political science, which starts with the classics, right, with Plato and Aristotle, right? One of the greatest advantages, how do you achieve public goods by individual cooperation. And that science was taken to its highest state of perfection in history here in the United States of America, and Churchill was a student of that. And that means, of course, we don't want to walk down the street and watch our neighbors in squalor. And we want to help them when they are. But how do you find a way to help them so that everybody can be free and then the whole society can prosper, but also apart? Because, you know, money is the necessary condition, right? If you're starving, you're not very much worried about how brushed up you are on your Shakespeare, right? But on the other hand, the minute people get money, they turn to other things. You guys are all here. And you're not here because you want to brush up on your doctoring, right? You're here because you want to save the world. You see an aspect of it, and you want to fix it, right? So the point is, you can't exclude that. And that means, sure, then what you would do is, you know, what I would do with healthcare and what I would do with welfare and what I would do. First of all that stuff needs to be localized. And if you do the insurance scheme right, in Britain, it was really privatized. Because you just went to the post office, right? But it didn't matter, that was the government. And you had your book. You better not lose it. You know, they could dig through the records and make it again. But, so the point would be that. Churchill's point was, it would not be right for us to let our fellow citizens starve or perish for want of care, but that doesn't mean they have a right in the same way that they have a right to talk. That's what he meant. That's what he said.
I have a question about what you meant by we're in a state of crisis in America right now, and I think all of us have our own ideas about that. Were you referring to the fact that we really have a lack of civil discourse between people who have different views of what America is and we're not going to survive? Because you made the comment that you don't think that we may, you know, survive it. So I wish you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think the incivility of our discourse is a symptom, not a cause. And I can tell you that it's matched in the 1850s and it's matched in the 1770s. There's a war on, right? We don't agree. Now, all you got to do is just think a little bit and you'll see how you'd separate a fundamental disagreement from a small or accidental disagreement. Aristotle says everything has four causes. It's made up of some matter, it has any artful thing, anything humans make, it's made by something, somebody, that is, you know. The great example is Michelangelo's David, right? So it's what you use when you teach this point, when you teach Aristotle's metaphysics. David's a very arresting and beautiful statue, and it's made of white marble. And it would be different if it were made out of something else, right? And then the David is made by Michelangelo. And, you know, that changes things. We're not as good as he was. And you just go look at it. I mean, it's just the minute you walk in the room. It has a form. So the material cause, the efficient cause, it has a form. The form is what it looks like. It looks like David. And David is not just anybody. David is a boy chosen by God to do a work. And he's got these big hands and these big feet, and he's standing like this, and his chin is up. You see? There's a figure in C.S. Lewis in one of his children's novels that's noble like that and is doing the bidding of God, and that figure is a horse. So you could have the form of a horse and you could show that. But no, this is a boy. Wonderful boy. When you get to the formal cause, now you're getting to the heart of the matter. And there's one more, the final cause. What is the final cause of the David? And the answer it is, whatever it was that Michelangelo loved that made him move. It drew it out of him. So now, apply that to America. The material cause is the land and its people, which is a very significant thing because we got a piece of land that was the biggest remaining. This can never happen again. And we got hold of it, and we settled it, and we only found out how big it was along the way. And we had a form of organization that permitted it to spread and grow like crazy. It's extremely successful, with all its problems, of course, right? So the material cause is important, but the efficient cause, that's the people who fashioned it, including all of us here today, right? Any volitional character that contributes to the being of a thing. Of course, the founders are terribly important, and they're unusual people. And then the form. What is the form of the United States of America? You can see it, just like you can see the statue of Michelangelo. Anytime it acts, anytime the United States of America acts as the United States of America, it acts in one of three places in Washington, D.C. There are cameras outside the White House, and there are cameras outside the Congress, the Capitol, and there are cameras outside the Supreme Court. And those are the first three articles of the Constitution that provide our form of government. And the form is hugely important because we are a kind of creature that demands that kind of form because the powers are separated, right? Madison writes, what is government but the profoundest of all commentaries on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be needed. See, we're not that kind of being, right? Just like we're not the dogs. We're the ones in the middle. If angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls on the government would be needed. That's the form of the government of the United States. And then what is the final cause of the United States of America? It's one of the most beautiful and important things ever written, and you know what it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? That's a war thing against a monarch who tried to answer it with force and reason. If you live in a time when the formal cause, the Constitution, and the final cause, the Declaration of Independence, are assailed and altered in meaning, that means now you've got an argument going on that affects everything. And that's what happened in the Revolutionary War, and that's what happened in the Civil War. And that's what's happening now. And it's a big thing because there's so much force. I mean, did you know that, look up sometime who are the 10 biggest givers in politics and see how many of them are public employee unions. Right? So that means that that smaller little circle is not small anymore. And I'm not saying that that's some accident of growth. Before all that happened, the people who invented these changes and pursued them wrote out that this was their object because the old form is obsolete. And remember, that's a crazy argument because John Dewey writes, the principles of the Declaration of Independence were very good for their time, a pioneer society. And that's stupid because that's not what they say. What they say is when in the course of human events, right? That means any time it becomes necessary for one people, that means any people, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of God, of nature, and of nature's God entitle them. That's the most universal thing you can imagine, right? And if it means that if it's not true now, it was not true then. But Dewey's real point is nothing is true in that sense because everything has changed. And our calling now is to get control of the process of change, where your art will lead for sure, except your conscience and your human reason outside your profession, it will lead to the shaping and manufacture of human being and the control of everything about them. And those are implicit and explicit in the principles of Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey, and before them Friedrich Hegel and the German historicists whom they copied. So you see, that's what's at stake, right? It's a tremendous thing, and the future of the world turns on it. Isn't that exciting? You know? I mean, it is, yeah, but, you know, what are we, weenies? You know? I mean, we got to, you know, I think it's time to man up here. And woman up, too. That'll be worse. Right? Because, look, I have to calculate here. So, there's a story, I think it's true, that Richard Nixon, but I can't prove it, but it illustrates something, whether it's true or not. Richard Nixon had evidence that John Kennedy stole votes in New Jersey and Massachusetts, maybe, and that the votes he stole made the difference. And there's lots of writing about this, by the way. It's an old and prominent allegation. And they said they had the goods on it and they were going to call attention to it. And Nixon said, no, we've had the election and we've counted the votes and it will throw the country into a constitutional crisis. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to run again sometime. Now, if that story is true, that story is honorable. And I can tell you many stories that I know to be true like that. Now, let's say that you have a memory that a person nominated for the Supreme Court did a bad thing a long time ago. And you wait until the process is almost exhausted, and you wait 35 years, and then you mention it. And it's just nigh impossible to prove such a thing, although certainly if he did it, that's very wrong. And he shouldn't be on the Supreme Court. But the point is, how are you going to know? And so, if we had that commonality between us, where, well, I'll give a story that I know to be true. It's in writing. Winston Churchill warned about socialism all his life. Incompatible with the continuation of British life. Our nation will have to be extensively depopulated if it comes in. In 1945, he says, the Socialist Party could not realize its ultimate aims without the use of a secret police. Yes, I mean a Gestapo. And then they beat him. After the war, right? It's devastating. And for the only time in his life, he's in opposition. And so the first time they have a party conference with the members of parliament getting together, how are we going to conduct ourselves? And then he gives a public speech and says what I'm about to say. He says, look, it is true that they got only 48% of the vote. And it is true that they got almost 2/3 of the seats. But we're not going to complain about that. Because this is our constitutional system, and this is how we are going to take power in our turn. Right? You heard Hillary Clinton talking about the Electoral College lately? You see, and I'm saying Winston Churchill was a lethal human being. You just didn't want to get in a war with that guy. He'd rip you to shreds. On the other hand, he was obedient to the law and the forms and final causes that preserve the law. And there's not enough of that now. And that's one of the signs of fever.
Sometimes I don't think people appreciate the wisdom of Trump.
Of
And
time?
Yeah. One of the wisest things that I saw Trump do was nominate Mike Pence for his vice presidency. Not just because I'm from Indiana, lifelong. I'm from Muncie. My husband, Tom, is the chief investment officer of the Ball State University Foundation, an accountant. But one of the things I read recently was a friend of Mike Pence for 20 years said that he talked with him when he was about to take the vice presidency nomination and said that he felt that he was nominated because it was for a time like this, just as Esther said. She was meant for a time like this, just as Joseph had been and David had been. And I'd said to Tom, I felt that that was the greatest nomination that Trump could have made because it showed his commitment to someone who had the values that Trump was trying to show the nation that he had. And Mike Pence had always upheld those values. You never see him without his wife, Karen, by his side. Trump has had his dalliances, obviously, but Mike Pence has had his wife by his side. And I think, as you talked about Churchill being one of the greatest statesmen, I think Mike Pence is going to come quietly forward as being a great statesman of our time. And I wondered what you thought of that potential.
Well, it so happens I know Mike Pence pretty well. I've known him a long time. He was our commencement speaker last year. To his entire speech writing staff are all people I've had in class. so I know him pretty well. And I'll say about him and about Trump, I like Trump. I supported him. I don't know him. I met him one time. But he upstaged me in a public lecture one time, as he does everybody else. But remember this. Between Lincoln and Churchill, and between Washington and Lincoln, there's a very long time. And so we're not really going to, I can tell you, I give my personal testimony for what it's worth, that Mike Pence is a very fine man. Is he a great statesman? Well, there's a lot of work to do before you know about that. And we should remember, too, this is a system of self-government. And the best thing I know about Mike Pence, I think, by the way, I think his marriage is really good, and we know them both. And I think, in his particular case, it has a lot to do with fear, as in mine. Yeah, because, what are you going to do, take that woman on? But, I think, and just another thing is, this, if you read the classic books, I know you've all dwelled on them so you could understand the Hippocratic Oath, what do you find out? That there are kinds of lives, and they make claims for excellence, right? The life of pleasure, the life of honor. There's something above those. And one thing that's above those is the life of the statesman. Very difficult life to live. Very hard to have the capacity for it. And in a funny way, it's opposite the life of the philosopher, and the saint, which is the highest. Because the philosopher thinks about things that are eternal. And you can only have knowledge of things that are always the same. Because other things, you can only be sure about them when you're looking at them. And a statesman's life is full of that. And it means that constant worry and adaptation. But we humans, see, we define our characters by our choosing. That's what makes us what we are over the course of our lives. You will remember significant choices you made, and those are important. But what they are is signs or tokens of the way you chose over and over for a long time. And that gets character. It comes from a Greek word, charesein, means to etch or engrave. That gets engraved into you. And what that helps you do is, anybody who's like Churchill or like Mike Pence or like Donald Trump or like Barack Obama, they're very good at practical judgment. They're very good at getting their way. They're very good at figuring out what people want and knowing how to get it from them, right? And there are other people who are not very good at that, and they don't become important people, let's say influential people. But on the other hand, there's something else that distinguishes the best of them from ordinary ones, and that is, not only do you have to choose what works in the circumstances, you have to have some sublime idea of what it means for a thing to work. In other words, there has to be some eternal thing wrapped up in the choices to give them dignity. And it's actually true that in the first two virtues that are named in Aristotle's Ethics, which are the two most immediate ones, one of them is courage, which is the right disposition toward danger. And the other is moderation, which is the right disposition toward pleasure. Now, that means that it doesn't mean that you go for danger and you avoid pleasure just to do the opposite of what people do. It means that when those things confront you, you calculate coolly and do the right thing. And you see, and the one who can do that, he has to have a sense of the eternal. And that's why the philosophers are the doctors of the city, and the statesmen are the guardians of the wise, or the doctors. There are many beautiful classic books that set up those arrangements. And so I'm not quick to call anybody Winston Churchill. We'll see. But we will see one of these days. Happened before, it'll happen again. Yeah.
Dr. Arnn, thank you. My name is Tamsin Rosenwasser. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I read the words of the founders chiseled in stone every day. And I began life in a country much freer than I am in now. Those of my relatives who fought in World War II in Korea did not fight for my freedom because I have lost my freedom, much of it. One of the great unconstitutional things that goes on is the interference of the federal government in medical care. I want a constitutional republic. That's my birthright. Now, we are engaged in a great entanglement here with the government. Supposing you were in charge of all of the colleges that the government supports with student loans and so forth. And then think of us with Medicare and Medicaid. How, this is a heavy lift, do you have some ideas, some practical ideas about how to challenge the constitutionality of Medicare and Medicaid? Because with the talk about Churchill, nobody was dying on the streets because this has been a very charitable country, and we ourselves are the good Samaritans, not a government whose only tool is force.
So, the main one I have is what I said, which is we should advocate elaborate schemes of social insurance that people contribute to and get a property right and can cash in for their care. Now, how do you make that work politically? Well, I will tell you that it has started looking promising to me about 15 years ago, and I confess it's only gotten worse since then. But the truth is, bureaucratic government is very unpopular. And the reason the Congress is so unpopular, there are two reasons. One of them is they're pretty bad. But the other one is they did this deal. And the deal is they delegate out the legislative power to these agencies, and they don't have to take blame for anything. And they used to be able to kind of manage those agencies, although the agencies are so powerful now that they ignore the Congress. And so this system is unpopular. And that means everybody, Donald Trump is a stark or sharp example, but everybody who's run for president and successfully in recent 2 decades, since Reagan, has run against the system. And so that means it's vulnerable. And I would, if I were you guys, I would, there's 2 kinds of knowledge you need to represent medicine in the public policy debate. You need to know about medicine, you got that, and you need to know about public policy. And the public policy points that matter to me are the unchanging and fundamental ones, because those are the most persuasive, and they are always useful. So if I were you, I would study the Constitution and make a lot of arguments, but I bet you're already doing that.
Well, we need to make them to the federal government somehow.
Well, you don't, actually, because that's a lost cause. We need to make them to the people. Does anybody think it's an accident that Hillsdale College talks to 20 million people a month? It's not.
Yes. In a book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the Second World War, there was a 13-year-old boy who was emaciated, who was hanging. And because he was so lightweight, he didn't die instantly. And when they were looking at the little boy, they were screaming, saying, "Where is God?" And someone from the audience who understood the situation said, "He's hanging." My question to you is, without a proper understanding of God in the least of these, and how we deal with one another with respect, in the absence of that faith base that we had, that our parents had, that our grandparents had, how do we put this Humpty Dumpty together again?
Well, so yes, and I'll add to it. So what's gone wrong, in my opinion, is not so much loss of faith. What's gone wrong is loss of reason. I don't know if you guys read C.S. Lewis, but I do. I teach him, teaching him this term he wrote a totalitarian novel. And what does he teach us about his own conversion? He began to understand that things are real, that they make sense. And what we think today is that nothing is real. Everything is changing. There's no room for God in that idea. So here's Aristotle's argument for God. Somebody hold up a glass, right? Just a glass, right? So look at the glass, right? There's lots of glasses in this room, and you never looked at cards to see what a glass was. You just know what they are. And human children, that's how they learn to talk. They can just see that. So now think of this. Somebody made the glass. What's higher, the glass or the making of the glass? Which? Yeah, see, you guys are doctors. No, come to find out it isn't. It's not the question what's higher, the human or the glass. What's higher, the activity of making the glass or the glass? And if you didn't want the glass, you wouldn't make the activity. In all arts, writes Aristotle, and art's just anything that produces anything, then the product is higher than the activity of the product. Health is higher than doctoring. That's what doctoring is for. Now, the glass is for drinking. Drinking is higher than the glass. So now look, you've got 2 steps up, 3 rungs on the ladder. But drinking is good for health. And health is good for its own sake. And that gives it a higher dignity than anything in that chain. But you know, you could be healthy and wealthy and victorious in war and intelligent, things Aristotle mentions, and you could still be miserable. What would complete all of those? That's argument 1 in the Nicomachean Ethics. Argument 2. Think about the kinds of beings that there are. Think of a rock. Think of a worm. Think of a dog. Think of a person. What's next? What would take the qualities in the human that are unique and superior to the qualities in any other beast and perfect them and remove all of the lower qualities? What would you have except a picture of God? So it's actually true that our idea of God is being destroyed by the idea that nothing means anything except what we want it to mean. You know, the first thing we do at Hillsdale College is, you know, because here's what kids are trained to do. I mean, if they come to our college, they're weird. But, you know, because we recruit like the Marine Corps. We just threaten the daylights out of them. And, you know, in the admissions process, in Cincinnati this week and in Minneapolis this week, 2 groups of people, about 1,000 together, and there were maybe 130 or something in the 2 of them admissions prospects. And I made them all stand up, and I then told them, you probably shouldn't come to our college. It'll be too hard for you, right? But here's what they do when they're young, because, you know, the most interesting questions are always about fundamental and eternal things, right? What is the good? Isn't that a great question? That's the question, right? But what is politics? What is medicine? Right? That question is more, those questions are more interesting than any particular aspect of those disciplines. They're a thing. What kind of thing are they? Where do they fit alongside other things? So what kids do, because it's so hard to answer that when you're young, right? Because everything about us, just like our physical growing and then decaying, our minds have to become populated with knowledge, and it takes time and effort. And so when you're young, you've got this boundless energy and intelligence, but you don't know anything. But what they know, they bring it from high school, is they say, well, I'll say, because I eat in the dining hall with the students. Anytime, any day I'm in town. If you come to Hillsdale College, find out the weeks I'm in town. It's known months in advance. If I'm in town, I'll take you to lunch in the dining hall and we'll beat up the students. And here's what it's like, right? You sit down with them, and it's a big deal, and there's cartoons about it in the paper. Everybody knows I do it. And everybody knows everybody else, and everybody knows me. And I'll say, what are you doing, And it never takes more than 3 or 4 questions to get them to say, it's good. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? They'll say, what are you studying? They'll say, politics. I'll say, what is that? Tell me about that. They don't know, And so when you get to the place where you say, what is it? You said, that's good. You brought it up. What is it for a thing to be good? And then sometimes they'll say, well, to me it means. And I say, well, okay, what if it means something different to me? And they'll say, well, then that's what it means to you. And I'll say, do you see what you've just said? It isn't a thing, right? It has no independent standing. We have to restore the common sense perceptions of human reason, and then we could understand what kind of thing God would have to be. And also that there would have to be one for everything we see to make sense, right? That's what I think. And just remember, you're going to write a letter to the King of England, and the King of England has issued a writ to an army to arrest you and bring you back to England, right? And you write you need something strong to take that guy on. You can't use English law, right? He makes it, and you're throwing it off. The laws of nature and of nature's God. You need both nature and God for that expression to be meaningful. And the good news is, it is meaningful.
Thank you. That's the problem with being tall. Thank you very much, Dr. Arnn, for such a wonderful, wonderful evening. So this concludes the evening activities. The hospitality suite will open in about 10 to 15 minutes, I believe. And it's in room 1214 for anyone who still has the energy to participate in further discussion. So that's it for the evening. Enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you bright and early in the morning.